Okay, folks, if you could take your seats, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone, both in the room and live stream with us virtually. I'm Anna West with Kearns & West, one of your facilitators for the session today. Before we go over the agenda and ground rules, we have some opening remarks from two special people who traveled from Washington, D.C. for us. Jim Lyons, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Department of Interior, is here, as well as Linda Lance, Deputy Director for the Bureau of Land Management. So I'd like to share the floor with them, and they'll provide some opening remarks, and then we'll get on to the rest of the session.
There we go. Very good. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our discussion about Planning 2.0. On behalf of Secretary Jewell and my immediate boss, Assistant Secretary Janice Snyder, I want to welcome you all here today. Appreciate your coming. I just want to highlight a few things about BLM and the significance of what we're engaging here today. For you and for those of you who are listening in or watching, because this is an important process that we're engaging in, and your input is incredibly valuable. So I think many of you probably know that BLM administers more public land than any other federal agency. In fact, we administer over 245 million acres. If you go to the BLM website, BLM likes to refer to itself as the little bureau with the big mission. What I want to emphasize at the outset is that these are public lands. The federal government doesn't own those lands. They're often referred to as federal lands, but in fact, you and I own these lands. So it's critical, as the owners of these lands, that you help us, as stewards of these lands for you, understand what it is you want from your lands. And it's important, as this process unfolds and as planning continues, that you play a very active role in helping us determine, in fact, how to manage these lands. Of course, that's where this planning process comes into play. Title II of FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which in fact is actually 40 years old this year, directed the BLM to develop a process to plan for the management of your public lands. So rules were written back 3+ decades ago, finally issued in 1983, and then revised only slightly in 2005. But as all of you know who live out here in the West, a lot has changed in the 3+ decades since those original rules were written. The West has grown rapidly. Pressures on the public lands to produce goods and services have increased, and managing the public lands for multiple use and sustained yield, which is the statutory direction that was provided to the BLM in FLPMA, has become more complex and much more challenging. At the same time, we've learned a lot more about these lands and how significant they are to those who use them and enjoy them. Science and technology have advanced. So we've learned more about the lands, and we've learned more about how they're used, how to use them, how to access resources we couldn't have accessed decades ago, in fact, just years ago, and how significant they are. Values have changed with regard to the use of these lands. And as a result, we've seen shifts in focus and in some instances a great deal of tension between one use and another. And a great example here in Colorado is the important growth of outdoor recreation over the past few decades. In fact, according to the Outdoor Industry Association, outdoor recreation in Colorado, not just on BLM lands, but across the landscape, produces $13.2 billion in spending and nearly $1 billion in state and local tax revenues every year. In addition, how we do planning has changed, our understanding of the planning process, and how we work with stakeholders to ensure that we understand both the values that you place in these lands and how you'd like us to manage these lands as stewards of your lands, as well as the concepts and principles associated with conservation. So the proposed BLM planning rules and the revisions that we're discussing in the context of this meeting today and throughout the planning comment process, I should say, is very, very important. And in fact, that dialogue is long overdue. The proposed BLM planning rules really embrace some key concepts that I think are associated with how these values have changed, but also recognize how planning and resource management has evolved over time. First of all, they recognize the need for us to look across larger landscapes as we work to manage these lands in a sustainable way. Those of you who have had to deal with the wildfires across the West in recent years, I think, are well aware of the fact that those issues don't stop at political boundaries, nor do they stop where administration of the lands change from BLM to Forest Service to the state or local jurisdictions. We've come to recognize how important it is to use the best available science and high-quality information in helping to determine how we manage these landscapes. In that regard, understanding both best science but also local knowledge and information is a critical part of ensuring that the information we have will ensure that we can sustain the management of these lands for the long term, consistent with our statutory direction. In addition, we've come to appreciate more and more the importance of collaboration, the importance of providing opportunities for the public to engage early and often in the process of determining how these lands are going to be managed, to ensure that, to the best of our ability, the interests of all owners and users of these lands are best met. In fact, Secretary Jewell likes to characterize where we are today as entering the 21st century of conservation, working at a landscape level, using science and technology to a much larger extent to help us understand both the character of these lands, the uses of these lands, and the impacts of different uses on their values, and focusing more on collaborative conservation. And it's so that foundation upon which BLM has really developed the planning rules that we're going to discuss today. We really appreciate your input and your interest in how these public lands are managed. We look forward to the comments you offer, your thoughts, the discussion we'll have today, and the important input that you provide throughout the planning process, and we're about in the middle of the planning process, so there's plenty of opportunity for additional input. And we certainly thank you for making the effort to come here today, to engage in this discussion, and most importantly, to help us understand as stewards of the public lands what it is you want from your public lands from here on out in the future. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Linda Lance, who's the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Land Management, for a few comments from BLM's perspective.
Thanks, you all. I just wanted to take 1 minute to say thank you from the BLM for caring about this rule and for caring about the lands that we have the enormous privilege to manage on your behalf and on behalf of all Americans. What I've learned since being at BLM is that that mission, that realization that these are your lands, these are the lands of all Americans, and that we are very, very fortunate to have the opportunity to try to take care of them in the best way that we can, is something that virtually everyone at BLM throughout the country, all 10,000 of us, feel very strongly about and worry about every single day. So what we're doing here is really the underpinning of that work. We cannot do it right without you and without those who care about it as much as you do. So we're so happy that you're here to help us think about moving from proposed to final in this rule. I'm here to listen. Your voices are the most important ones. And I want you to reach out to your friends and neighbors and your relatives in other states and people all over the country to say, come and play on this rule development and on management of these lands. We can't get this right without you, and we need to hear from all the voices who have all different perspectives on how you manage these lands and resources and what should be done with them. This work is very, very challenging work. BLM, I like to think, is the hardest job of all the land management bureaus because we have the multiple use mission that challenges us every single day. So thank you for being here today. Stick with us through this process. And our goal is to get this as right as we can in terms of finalizing this rule and then implementing it to manage these lands on the ground. We feel like we've learned a lot over the last 30 years since the initial rules were written, but we're really starting into a new phase, and we still have a lot to learn. So, so stick with us and reach out to your friends and neighbors, even those that disagree with you about how these lands should be managed. Get them to the table. If they're not at the table, we can't do this right. So that's, in my mind, that's the top line information about this rule. Shasta will give you and do a great job in explaining the detail, and she has been one of the heroes for us in putting this rule together. And so you have our true expert here today. But I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this today and as we continue to move through this to take it to final and to implement it. And thank you on behalf of the BLM for being our partners in taking care of these most amazing places. So I look forward to hearing the discussion today.
Thank you, Jim and Linda. What I'm going to do is just quickly roll through the agenda and the ground rules for the day, and then we'll start the substance. So as a reminder, the purpose of today's meeting is to help you understand what BLM has drafted and the intent and the backdrop behind what the draft rule includes. It's an opportunity to ask clarifying questions, and when we get to breakout groups, it'll be an opportunity for an exchange and discussion amongst smaller groups. This isn't the meeting today is not the place where you could provide formal comments. You can do that, and we'll give you more information later online or in written form. If you do want to provide public comments today, there are 2 computers in the back of the room, and that's where you would go and submit online comments. So briefly, we're just finishing this first segment of Welcome and Overview. Then Shasta Ferrano will give an overview of the draft rule, and we'll have a brief moment for any clarifying questions just to understand what she presented. But it'll be very brief. Then we will go into breakout groups. And so live streaming will be turned off, and I'll explain the format. But we have 4 topics, and we'll have you go to your topic areas, and we'll explain that in a second. But you see public involvement, planning assessment, and high-quality information, planning framework, and landscape approach. So we'll have breakout groups. We'll be rotating every 15 minutes, so you will cover all 4 of the topics this morning. Then we'll briefly have a brief break and regroup in plenary to hear sort of the highlights from the topical areas, and also an opportunity for further exchange or Q&A, including for those folks on the live stream. And then we'll summarize and finish at 1 o'clock. For the live stream participants, if you see this now on the slide, this is where you would provide your questions, and we have a staff of 3 ready to collect the questions and try to distill it down to the handful that we'll be able to take and field here. And also, if you're online, you can see all these materials are posted at the website below, blm.gov/live. And these are the breakout groups, as I mentioned. Quick ground rules. This is about the proposed Planning Rule 2.0. This isn't about other BLM-related topics, so that's what the focus of today is. And in our public discussion, we want to make sure you're asking all your clarifying questions to understand what BLM intended and what they've put together. They can also clarify the public comment process, and we're also hoping there's going to be an exchange and discussion amongst the subgroups, so you really have an opportunity for some dialogue, both amongst yourselves and with BLM. Ground rules, just honor the agenda. Because we're live streaming and just in respect of everybody's time, we're already over, but we're gonna try and stick to the timeframes of the agenda. Of course, we encourage respectful and constructive dialogue amongst each other. We have different interests in the room. They're all important, and we need to appreciate and understand and work with each other in a manner that is respectful of that. We're asking to provide balance in speaking time. The facilitators will help you try to do this, but if you could make your point briefly so we have time for more exchange with others, that would be helpful. Listen carefully to each other. Try to express your interests, not your positions. We're asking you to avoid side conversations, which you're already doing, thank you, and also turn your cell phones off so we don't have ringing in the room. I think that's it. Any questions? Seeing none, I think it's time to move over to Shasta to help us get an overview of the rule.
All right, thank you everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today. Over the last 2 years, I've had the great privilege of being the project manager for Planning 2.0, which includes both this proposed rule as well as a revision of our land use planning handbook. Over that time, I've gotten to meet several of the people in the room through our listening sessions that we hosted just over a year ago. I was able to read all of the letters that you sent in our initial public input, and I really hope that you see some of what you sent us in what I'm about to present right now. We received just a great number of really thoughtful comments and input about a year ago. And we've taken all that information and thought really hard on it. So we're really pleased to present this proposal to you today. But before I jump into the proposal, I want to talk really briefly about the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we proposing changes to our planning process? And I have 3 slides to talk about that. So the first is about collaboration. As I believe Jim mentioned, our planning rule is basically about 30 years old. There were some small updates in 2005, but 1983 was the last major updates. So over those last 30 years, we've learned a lot of lessons, we've learned a lot of best practices, and one of those is that collaboration, effective collaboration, is the key to good planning. This means collaboration with our partners from state and local government. It means collaboration with the general public, with key stakeholders, basically with anyone who has an interest in the public lands, because as Linda mentioned, these are your public lands. We've also learned that collaboration is best when it's done early and often. And so you'll see in the presentation I give today that we've tried to embody that in our planning process, early and often collaboration, as well as additional transparency so that you can see how the plan develops through the various stages of the planning process. We've also learned that resources cross boundaries, as do social, economic, and other characteristics. And we believe that because resources cross boundaries, that our resource management also has to be responsive to crossing boundaries. And so what we've done in this proposed rule is we've tried to build in ways that we can take this landscape look and this landscape approach when we look at planning so that our plans have decisions that are responsive to the resource issues and also the resource opportunities. And then finally, we've learned that when change occurs, and of course change is going to occur, it's inevitable, we need to be able to respond. We need to be able to respond quickly and in a meaningful way. And so in our proposed rule, we've built in types of adaptive management that allow us to better respond while still focusing our plans on durable and meaningful decisions that are based on the conditions we want to achieve, while providing some flexibility in the actual techniques and the methods that we apply to achieve those conditions. I'll get into detail on that. So a little more background. As Jim mentioned, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act is our founding legislation for the BLM. It's almost 40 years old now. The Federal Land Policy Management Act tells us several important things. One is it tells us that we need to develop land use plans to guide management in the future. So we need to take a thoughtful approach to how we manage the public lands, and we do this through the planning process. It also tells us that we need to involve the public when we develop these land use plans, and we need to coordinate with our state and local partners. Additionally, it tells us that we need to be consistent with state and local plans to the extent that it's practical and to the extent that it's consistent with federal law, which of course we must comply with. We're not proposing changes to FLTMA today, of course, but we are proposing changes to our regulations which implement FLTMA. So the how. FLTMA tells us to develop land use plans, but how do we develop those land use plans? What are the steps that we take to do it? So all of that is laid out in our planning regulations, and the proposed rule that I'll talk about today is a revision of our planning regulations. As part of this greater Planning 2.0 initiative, we're also revising our land use planning handbook. We're not going to talk much about the handbook today, but I just wanted to point out that that's an active area where we have a team that's working right now to develop this handbook. So as the regulations, I said, are the how to develop land use plans, then the handbook goes into the nitty-gritty details of how do you actually do those steps that were laid out in the regulations. Basically, it's the step-by-step guide to do it. I'll touch a little bit on some changes in the handbook through my presentation, but again, we're tabling that topic for a few months down the road. So here's the general steps of the rulemaking process. As I mentioned previously, we started with initial outreach, and that was in fall of 2014, so about a year and a half ago. We hosted a couple of listening sessions, one of them here in Denver, another out in California, and we also accepted written comments. We got many, many great comments, and all of that information was used to inform the proposed rule. In addition to the public comment we got, we also did an internal outreach. We spoke with our BLM planners, we spoke with our BLM managers, and basically asked them, how could we improve the planning process from your perspective? What are the common steps or problems that you see occur, the areas where time is added into the schedule, because if you had done something differently up front, you might have been able to miss that problem or avoid that problem. Truly trying to find out what are our best practices across an agency and which one of these can we apply more consistently across the agency. The proposed rule was made available to the public on February 11th. We posted it to our BLM website and issued a media release. And then it officially published in the Federal Register, I believe on February 25th, and that initiated the 60-day public comment period. So we're in the middle of the public comment period right now. I think we're about halfway through exactly, and it's currently open through April 25th of this year. We had a webinar on Monday. I know some people of the room have already told me they participated, which is great. We've posted the recording of that webinar to our project website, so anyone can go back and listen to it whenever you'd like. We'll also be posting a recording of the live stream versions of today to our project website, so you can go back and review that as well. And of course, that will only include these full group sessions. The breakout groups will not be in that recording. And then we are accepting written comments. And at the end of my presentation, I'll go into some detail on how to submit written comments. So now, what you've all been waiting for, I'm sure. What are the proposed changes? Before I go into this, I just want to point out there is a lot of detail in this proposed rule. In this presentation, I'm going to hit what I think are the most important changes, the highlights. But there's no way I could get through every single detail in the document. So I encourage you to read the rule yourself and make sure that you understand all of the details that are in there. So the first big proposed change is to our overall planning framework. So when I say planning framework, basically what I mean is the content of a resource management plan and the supporting documents. And the goal behind this change is to improve the BLM's ability to apply adaptive management and also to achieve the desired future conditions that we're trying to get in the planning area. So under the proposed rule, we've identified two categories that fall within this planning framework. The first is plan components. These are essentially our land use plan decisions. The second is implementation strategies. These are strategies that we would develop to help us implement the plan, but there's no decision that's made at the planning level. Rather, these are just this is the best way we think to go about implementing the plan. The implementation strategies are where the adaptive management comes in. The implementation strategies, because they're just the tools we're using to implement the plan, we would incorporate new information as needed. So they would be more flexible. But the plan components, these would be decisions. They would require an amendment to change, and any future action that the BLM takes, whether it be permit approval, whether it be an action that the BLM is going to implement, would need to conform with the plan components. So first I'm going to walk through the plan components. So on your left-hand side are the goals and objectives. Under the proposed rule, this is basically what drives the development of the plan, or really what I mean is what drives resource management in the planning area. The goals and objectives, what are we actually trying to achieve? And I have a slide for each of these to explain the definitions. On the right-hand side are plan components that are essentially tools to achieve the goals and objectives, as well as to monitor and evaluate, are we achieving those objectives? So I'm going to go into detail with each one. First is the goals. These are our desired characteristics of the planning area or a portion of the planning area. These could be resource characteristics, social characteristics, economic characteristics, environmental, ecological. Any of these things could be embodied in the goals. And a few examples I give here, and these are really just meant to illustrate the concept. Every individual planning effort would develop goals that are unique to that planning area. So one type of goal would be landscapes are resilient to disturbance, including drought, fire-related disturbance, or climate change. Or a different type of goal, solar energy development is prioritized in areas with high solar potential and low resource conflicts. So the goals are broad statements of what are we trying to achieve in our future planning area. The goals could be landscape-minded and responsive to cross-boundary issues or concerns. The goals could also be very local-based and focus in on a unique area within a planning area with a unique goal for that area. Next is the objectives. Objectives are basically specific and measurable resource conditions that are developed to guide progress toward one or more goals. So I think of these as the goals are what we're trying to achieve on a more lofty, aspirational sense. The objectives are the things that the BLM actually manages for. These are what we are going to manage for, the resource conditions, but these are helping us to achieve our goals. Under Planning 2.0 and the proposed rule, we want to move towards what are called quote-unquote SMART objectives: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. I'll give a few more slides on how we think we can get there. So resource conditions would be defined using this concept of key attributes and indicators. Before I move into the next slide, I just want to point out this concept of key attributes and indicators is not actually something that's in the proposed rule. This is something we're developing through the handbook. So this is the how-to. How would we actually achieve these specific and measurable resource conditions? The reasoning I'm presenting it today is because I just want to give all of you kind of a sneak peek of how are we actually going to do this, and make sure you know that we are thinking through how will we actually implement this rule. So first, a key attribute. A key attribute is any aspect of the resource that clearly defines or characterizes the resource. An indicator is how the key attribute will be measured. So an example, let's say the resource that we were making a decision about relates to pronghorn antelope. A key attribute, right? What really defines the resource, and what do we actually, when we think about resource conditions that we're going to manage for, it might be the connectivity of the migration route for the pronghorn antelope population. So possible indicators, what would we actually measure? The amount of disturbance and bottlenecks, perhaps. Physical barriers to movement, perhaps. Vegetation composition in areas where the herd rests over during their migration. All of these could be possible indicators. So I just want to point out, this is only an example. We would develop these key attributes and indicators for all of the different resources and the objectives that we make, not just for wildlife. And the proposed rule does not go into this detail. The proposed rule simply states that the BLM would be required to develop specific and measurable objectives. This is the how we would measure them. So then this ties very closely to the concept of monitoring and evaluation. So we develop these specific and measurable objectives. Those objectives have indicators, right? The how we're actually measuring. And then those indicators would be the same indicators we'd use for monitoring evaluation. So essentially, when we developed our plan objectives, we're also thinking about how are we going to monitor to see if we're achieving these objectives. If you're familiar with BLM's current planning process, for most plans, not all plans, the objectives tend to be more aspirational in nature. I would even argue that many of our plans have objectives that are really more like goals. Under the proposed rule, Our objectives would have to be specific and measurable, so we would know if we're achieving it or not. And not only would we know, but you would know as well. So we believe this provides more accountability and more transparency to our partners and the public about whether we're actually achieving what we said we're going to achieve. It also sets us up for better success when we go into monitoring, because we've thought through how are we going to monitor this plan. And so that ties us into when we develop these objectives, we really need to think about, because this is specific and measurable, can we monitor it? If there is no way to monitor it, perhaps it's not the best objective because there's no way to know if we're achieving it. All right, so back to our plan components slide. I talked about the goals and objectives. Again, the goals and objectives are the drivers of the plan. This is essentially the desired future that we're trying to achieve under our planning process. All management direction is directed at achieving these goals and objectives. On the right-hand side are tools for how we're going to achieve the goals and objectives. So we have monitoring and evaluation standards. I just talked about that, but that would basically be the indicators and the intervals for when we're going to monitor and evaluate. Designations, I'll talk about those in the next slide. Resource use determinations. And then this last one, lands available for disposal. I just want to touch very briefly on this one. I'm not going to have a slide on it, but this is basically connecting back to Section 203 of FLPMA. There's a specific provision that lays out criteria for if the BLM is going to offer lands for disposal, it can do so through the planning process if they meet these specific criteria. FLPMA tells us that those lands have to be identified for the planning process, and so that's why we've made these a plan component. All right, so designations. Designations are basically identifying an area where we're going to direct management towards a priority value or use to help us either achieve an objective or to maybe there's other applicable legal requirements that we need to achieve, and so it could also be for that reason. In the proposed rule, we identified two types of designations. Planning designations are the first type. Those are identified through the land use planning process. So examples of planning designations: areas of critical environmental concern, special recreation management areas, solar energy zones. We're going to prioritize an area, and we identify that during planning. The other type of designations are non-discretionary designations. So these are designations that are done by either the president, Congress, some other higher authority, and they're provided to the BLM, and then we manage for them consistent with the direction that we're either given by the president or Congress. So let me give you a few examples. Wilderness is a non-discretionary designation. We do not designate wilderness, but when it does get designated, we manage consistent with the guidelines. National monuments would be another non-discretionary designation. National conservation areas. The other type of plan component that I want to touch on are these resource use determinations. These are areas of public lands or mineral estate where specific uses are excluded, restricted, or allowed. So if you're familiar with our current planning process, this is somewhat analogous to our allowable uses. One thing I want to point out is that when I say restricted, that this resource use determination would include any of the specific restrictions applied at the planning level. So let me give you an example. On this bottom one, open to mineral leasing with major or moderate constraints. If there were major constraints or moderate constraints, for example, lease stipulations that were going to be required at the land use planning level, i.e. anywhere where this resource use determination is made, that lease stipulation will be required, then that would be part of the resource use determination. In contrast, if there are constraints that are going to be applied at the site-specific level or the leasing level, those would not happen right now. Those would not be part of a resource use determination. Those would happen at the site-specific level, and they would require site-specific NEPA analysis. All right, so back to my planning framework diagram. We talked about the plan components, and I just want to repeat to make sure everyone heard it. Plan components could only be changed through a land use plan amendment, and all future actions would have to conform with these plan components. We also identify in the role this other category, implementation strategies. These are basically strategies that we think will help us to implement the plan, to help us to prioritize our work when we go into implementation, and perhaps streamline some of our processes for implementation. So with implementation strategies, we develop a strategy during the planning process, but there's no final decision at the planning process. These are high level. These are things like best management practices, or let's say, for example, we have an objective related to maintaining a certain vegetation composition. This would be the techniques we're going to use. Are we going to apply vegetation manipulations? Are we going to do controlled burns? So identifying the tools we're going to use, the decision associated with them would be made at the implementation stage, whether or not we're actually going to implement it. These could be updated at any time to incorporate new information. So new information, that might mean new science. New science becomes available, and we want to be responsive to it, right? There's a new technique that's more responsive, more effective at achieving our objectives, and we want to include that. Or perhaps we find out through monitoring and evaluation that what we're applying isn't actually effective in achieving our objectives. Then we might try applying something else. We've added in this fourth bullet point here that any updates to implementation strategies would be required to be made available for public review at least 30 days prior to their implementation. So this is trying to provide transparency. If we do make updates, we're going to make those available to people. And everyone can, of course, provide input if they have it at that time. So in the proposed rule, we've identified two types of implementation strategies. The first one is management measures. These are future actions that the BLM may take to achieve the goals and objectives. So again, these are those best management practices or those vegetation techniques that we're going to do, controlled burning, restoration activities that we intend to apply. The second type is monitoring procedures. So in contrast to monitoring and evaluation standards, which are a plan component, these are the specific methods that we use for monitoring. So the monitoring and evaluation standards, the plan component, are the indicators and the intervals. What are we actually going to monitor, and how often? These are the methods, the techniques. So let me give you an example. Let's say we're talking about vegetation. Are we going to use remote sensing imagery? Or are we going to do field surveys? If we are going to do field surveys, what technique, what type, what method will we use? So the idea is that the monitoring procedures, that we'd identify that during the planning process, but we could update it if we needed to. A good example of why this is necessary: we never could have guessed 20 years ago that remote sensing imagery would be so widely available and that it would be such high resolution. If that was a plan component, then we'd never be able to take advantage of those advances in technology without going through a full amendment process. So this provides us that flexibility to take advantage of advances in technology as they happen. All right, so next I want to walk through the procedural changes. So I just talked about the planning framework. This is basically what's the content or the decisions we make of the plan in the plan. Now I'm going to talk about process, the steps that we go through in planning. So here you see a diagram of our overall planning cycle. Historically, when we talk about planning, usually we're just talking about one stage here, the developing the RMP. Under the proposed rule, we're trying to emphasize that planning is actually a cycle. It includes developing the RMP, but it also includes implementing the RMP, monitoring the RMP, evaluating the RMP, adjusting, right, through an amendment if necessary, and this new step called a planning assessment, which I'll explain in great detail. What we've tried to build into the proposed rule is that each of these stages would set us up for success in the next stage. So for example, I talked earlier about when we develop our objectives, we'd be thinking about the indicators and what we're going to monitor for. We'd be doing that during the development of the RMP, but that would be setting us up for better success when we implement and monitor the RMP. So first I want to focus in on these two steps, the planning assessment and developing the RMP. So the diagram you see in front of you is a very, very simplified schematic of our current steps we take in developing an RMP, and specifically the points where we go out to the public. So first, we go out for scoping. This basically initiates the development of an RMP. We take all that information, we prepare a draft RMP, and then we go out to the public. So there's no checks, there's no points of contact between scoping and the draft RMP. And as you know, if you've participated in a planning process, that might be several years in between. There's a public comment period on the draft RMP. We take those public comments, we analyze them, we respond to them, we revise the RMP, and then we issue the proposed RMP. And again, might be a few years in between on that arrow. And then after the proposed RMP, there's a protest period. We take that information, we may revise the RMP if necessary, and then we issue a decision. So first, under Planning 2.0, we propose this new step called a planning assessment. This is an upfront step. It would happen before we really formally initiate the development of the RMP and before we go to scoping. The planning assessment is basically understanding the baseline conditions in the planning area. I'll go into more detail. The other thing I want to point out is that we've added in an additional touch point between scoping and the draft RMP. Here I'm calling it the preliminary alternatives. So it'd basically be an opportunity to check in with the public partway and get your input, see if we're on the right track before we issue that draft RMP. And the goals behind these new checkpoints. Early public involvement. Like I mentioned earlier, we've learned that early public involvement and frequent public involvement leads us to better success when we get to the final decision. We've also learned that although this adds time into the planning process, and we realize that there will be time added in to do this extra work, ultimately, it makes for a more efficient planning process, because when we get to that draft plan, it's going to be a more robust draft plan. It's going to be much less likely that we're going to have to supplement the plan. And so we think that there'll be efficiencies gained on the second half. And we've seen this already in our plans that have done this, because we can already do this. You can have this preliminary alternative step if you want to. And some plans have done that it has been a very positive thing. It's led to ultimately to efficiencies in the process, and it's led to better plans. The second, increased transparency along the process. Like I mentioned, it can be several years in between our current steps. So providing transparency on our progress as we're developing the draft RMP. Improving science-based decision-making, and specifically that ties into the planning assessment. And then also applying the landscape approach, which specifically ties into the planning assessment. So I'll go into more detail. So our planning assessment would replace our current analysis of the management situation, or the AMS. The AMS is an internal step right now that we do between scoping and the draft RMP. So under the proposed rule, we would no longer do the AMS. Instead, we would do a planning assessment. The steps of the planning assessment include information gathering, evaluation of information quality, assessment of baseline conditions, and a summary report. I want to point out, if you're familiar with the U.S. Forest Service 2012 planning rule, that there are some similarities to our planning assessment and the assessment phase in their rule. We did this intentionally because we view this as an opportunity for collaboration with our partners in the Forest Service, specifically when it comes to data gathering and establishing baseline conditions. We can gain many benefits just through economy of scale, but also in applying the landscape approach if we combine efforts when we're doing this data gathering and this assessment of baseline conditions. And we already have some plans that are going in this direction. For example, in Northern California, one of our plans that's in early development is collaborating with the Forest Service on doing some data collection in that area. And it's been very successful so far. So I want to talk in a little more detail about some of these steps. So information gathering. This would include BLM inventories, inventory of the land and the resources. It would include a public data call. So basically, we'd go out to the public and we'd ask, do you have any data? Do you have information you want to share with us? We'd reach out to our state and local partners, because we know that oftentimes those are the ones who have the best data. Oftentimes the local wildlife agencies, the state wildlife agencies, they have the best data when it comes to wildlife. And so we've built a step into the process for coordination. We'd also accept data from the general public. For example, if you have access to an academic study, something you want to make us, literature that you want to make us aware of. Recreation groups often have good user data from their own resources. We would consider all of this information. We also have a step for identifying relevant policies, guidance, strategies, or plans. So this is to make sure that if there's other things happening and our planning area ties into this, we want to make sure we know. So for example, if there's a state wildlife action plan, we want to make sure we know before we initiate planning what's in that state wildlife action plan. If there's a regional mitigation strategy, that's very important to make sure that we're aware of that, and that's part of our planning assessment. The landscape conservation cooperatives, many of them are initiating landscape conservation designs, which are basically collaborative processes for developing a regional conservation design. If there's been an effort, and many of the stakeholders have participated in it in our planning area, then that's something we need to be aware of. Or even just local land use plans. This is the opportunity for us to go out to them and ask them to share that with us. And then finally, identifying relevant public views. We're calling this internally the envisioning process. And my next slide will go into more detail on that. So basically, the envisioning process is where we'd go out to the public during our planning assessment, and we'd ask these 3 questions. What's important to you? Why is it important? And where is it important? So really what we're trying to understand through this envisioning process is public values in the planning area. What's important to you? This is really critical information for us to have up front, because when we think about our plans, our goals and objectives, establishing the desired future that we want to move towards, we need to know what that desired future is in the eyes of our public. This would inform the scoping process. And in the plans that have started doing this, we've seen that it's been extremely important for building relationships, building partnerships up front before we even start planning, so that we have those in place when we go into the planning process. I want to talk a little bit about this concept of high quality information. So I mentioned that we would do a public data call. We've added something into the rule that specifically talks to a commitment to only use high quality information in our plans. We've defined this as any representation of knowledge that is accurate, reliable, unbiased, not compromised through corruption or falsification, and relevant to the planning process. So we didn't actually come up with this term, high quality information, on our own. This term is used in the Data Quality Act, and it's also used in the Department of Interior's Data Quality Standards, or Data Quality Guidelines, I think is what it's called. So basically what we've added is a commitment in our planning rule that we are going to use this high quality information. One thing I'd like to point out is that we're actually already required to use high quality information, so this isn't really a substantive change. We just want to be very transparent and clear when we're doing this public data call that this is something that we're going to do. So just because someone shares data with us, if it doesn't meet the standard, then we won't use it in our planning process. We will, of course, consider it, and we will, if we're not going to use it, we'll explain why, but we only use high quality information. So what does this include? Well, it certainly includes the best available scientific information, and in most circumstances, I imagine that's what it will be. But we use this broader term, high quality information, because there are other types of information that are relevant to planning. One example is traditional ecological knowledge. So basically, traditional knowledge of the area and the resources. This is a term that's been used more and more often as we recognize the value of this traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge, even if we include it in planning, it's very relevant. It still needs to meet this high quality information standard. And so what I mean by that is, if we're going to go out and collect this information, we wouldn't just talk to one tribe. We wouldn't just talk to one local ranching family. We need to make sure that it's representative, that it's unbiased. So we need to be very careful and thoughtful about the methods we'd use to collect this information. And then finally, we take all this information, right? We've done this great information gathering effort, and we use that to assess the planning area. So establish the baseline conditions in the planning area so that we understand this before we start talking about decisions, before we start talking about issues. What are the conditions? This includes resource, environmental, ecological, social, and economic conditions. All right, so I talked quite a bit about the planning assessment. We will have a breakout group about the planning assessment and this concept of high quality information. So if you have questions about that topic, because I know it's a big topic, think about them now and bring them to that group. Next, I want to talk about scoping and the preliminary alternatives. So we aren't proposing much in terms of changes to the scoping process. The one thing that we have identified is this concept of planning issues. And we've added a definition of planning issues. This is actually a term we already use. It's in our land use planning handbook, but it wasn't previously defined in our regulations. These are basically disputes, controversies, or opportunities related to resource management. So the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people have asked, well, you're going to be doing this envisioning process. How is this different than scoping? And the difference is, envisioning, as I mentioned, is really a conversation about values, right? What do we want the future planning area to look like? Scoping is a conversation about issues. Now that we've figured out the future that we want, what are the issues to getting there? Where are there disputes? Where are there controversies? Or where are there opportunities that we need to make sure we take? we'd use this information and we'd develop our range of alternatives. So the range of alternatives would be the plan components for each alternative. I just want to highlight here that the range of alternatives would include plan components. We would not be developing implementation strategies at this stage. That would come later. That would actually come at the proposed plan stage. So we developed the preliminary alternatives. We'd also develop this new idea called the rationale for alternatives. So this includes, how does each alternative address the planning issues? So how is the range responsive to the issues? What is the management direction that is common to all alternatives? How does management direction vary across the alternatives to address the planning issues? So really, this is the explanation for our range of alternatives. If you participate in our current planning process, this is something that you would see in the record of decision. What we're proposing is to have it up front and early on so that when we make those preliminary alternatives available to the public, we're also explaining our rationale behind what we did, our thought process. We'd also include something called the basis for analysis. This is basically the procedures, the assumptions, and the indicators that we intend to use for our effects analysis. So we won't have done the effects analysis yet, but we'll have thought through how we're going to do it. We'd make this available with the preliminary alternatives. The reason for this is that one of the things that we see is many of the comments that we get on our draft RMPs have to do with this basis for analysis. For example, the comment will say, hey, BLM, you didn't use the best procedure. There's actually, when we're talking about best available information, there's a better one, and here's the science to back it up. Or we don't believe you used the appropriate indicator. That's information that we'd like to have before we even go into the effects analysis. So this is a check with the public that if you think there is something better, you can share that information and we can consider it before we do the work of the effects analysis. Again, this is something that will take some time up front, but we think it'll lead to efficiencies once we have that draft plan and make it less likely that we'll need to supplement the plan. The rationale for alternatives and the basis for analysis essentially replace our existing planning criteria. So under the proposed rule, we would no longer develop planning criteria. Instead, we'd be doing these two things. And then we'd make all this information available to the public. And specifically, we'd be looking for these questions. Is the range of alternatives complete? Is any relevant information missing? Is the rationale sound? Is the basis for analysis sound? So I want to point out, this is not a formal public comment period. How we make them available is probably going to vary depending on the complexity of the planning effort. If it's a simple planning effort, it might be as simple as posting them to our website, announcing it to our listserv, and maybe issuing a media release. If it's a more complicated planning effort with complicated issues, then we might decide to host public meetings around these and have some discussion. We would consider any of the input that we received, and the final draft alternatives would be informed by that input, but we're not intending to do any formal comment response on that. So you'd never actually see a comment summary on that. All right, so a few things I want to point out about process. So we're doing the planning assessment up front. We're doing the preliminary alternatives. So by the time we get to the draft RMP, this would be the second opportunity that the public's seen our range of alternatives. It would be the second time that they've seen our basis for analysis, so how we're going to do our analysis. It would essentially be the second time that you've seen our affected environment, because the planning assessment would be, in essence, the affected environment. And so because of this and the extra time it's take, we're proposing a shortening of the public comment period on our draft plan. So currently it's 90 days, and we propose to shorten it to 60 days. I know this sounds counterintuitive because we're saying more public involvement is our goal. Why would you be shortening a public comment period? Really what we're trying to get here is a balanced approach. So if we're going to add these additional opportunities, which will take more time, trying to balance that timeline by having a shortened comment period here. And then we also think it will be balanced by the efficiencies that we'll gain from having a more robust draft RMP. Of course, this is a proposal, and if you don't think that this is the right way to get to that balance, we're welcome to hear your ideas on a better approach. So now I want to talk quickly about the protest period and some changes to protest. So the changes to protest aren't substantial, but there are a few changes. First, we think we have improved language in there on what constitutes a valid protest. The existing language is very subjective. It basically says that a protest has to identify why the director's decision is wrong. So it's quite subjective. So instead, we've identified in here that protests would identify plan components believed to be inconsistent with law, regulation, or policy, and explain why. This actually isn't dramatically different from how we currently parse out protest issues when we do protest. We're just being more transparent so that the public knows how to submit a protest that we can actually use and respond to, what we're actually looking for in those protests. We've added an option to submit protests electronically, so you wouldn't have to mail a hard copy anymore if you don't want to. Of course, we'll always accept hard copies as well. And we've made a commitment that we'll make protests available to the public for increased transparency. I also wanted to point out, we've had many comments come in about coordination and cooperating agencies. BLM will continue to coordinate with government entities consistent with the direction provided in FLTMA. And actually, under this proposed rule, there are several new opportunities for coordination. So I think it will only make our opportunities for coordination that much more robust. Government entities can also participate as cooperating agencies as they currently do so. And under the proposed rule, there'd be new opportunities for cooperating agencies to participate if they choose, including the preparation of the planning assessment, the formulation of the preliminary alternatives, the revision of the preliminary alternatives based on public input, and the development of implementation strategies. So additional ways for us to engage with cooperators. All right, so returning to the planning cycle, I want to talk really briefly about this side of the cycle. And again, this would apply to our goals to do science-based decision-making and adaptive management. So as I mentioned earlier, monitoring would be based on indicators, and then we'd evaluate to see if the plan objectives are being met. We've added a commitment in the proposed rule that we'll make that summary report available to the public. So right now, the public never has an opportunity to see the results of evaluation. So basically, we're trying to build more checks with the public through our full planning cycle. And then after we do that evaluation, we'd either adjust our implementation strategies if needed. Let's say a plan objective was not being met, but we realized that there might be a better way that we can do it through our implementation strategies, or we may need to initiate a plan amendment or a revision. I want to talk really briefly about a question in the proposed rule. And this is basically somewhere where we weren't really 100% sure what the right answer was, and so we've just put a question out there, and we want your help in figuring it out. And this is, how do we deal with amendments, specifically EIS-level amendments? Should they follow the same procedures that we follow when we prepare an RMP or revise an RMP? Or should EIS-level amendments follow the basic NEPA procedures, but the additional steps that I've outlined be applied on a case-by-case basis? So essentially what I'm asking in this question is, should we require that a planning assessment be completed for every EIS-level amendment, or should that be applied on a case-by-case basis? Should we require that preliminary alternatives review for every EIS-level amendment, or should that be decided on a case-by-case basis? We welcome your input on this question. So a few more general changes, close to the end of my presentation. ACECs, areas of critical environmental concern. We've revised some language in here to avoid confusion. The existing language in the regulations we find is a bit hard to understand, so we've tried to make it easier to understand. In these revisions, the potential ACECs would need to be identified through inventory and during the planning assessment. So essentially that, if you're familiar with ACECs, the relevance and importance criteria are the two criteria that you have to meet to become a potential ACEC. And then the BLM develops a list of all the potential ACECs that will be considered for designation during the planning process. That list of potential ACECs would be part of the planning assessment report. This is something that the public currently only sees at the draft plan, so you get to see it a lot earlier than you currently do. We've also proposed a few procedural changes. So we've proposed removing the 60-day comment period on ACECs, and instead, ACECs, whenever an ACEC is involved, we just use the comment period that's appropriate to the local level of NEPA. So if it's a revision, under the proposed rule, it would be a 60-day public comment period on the draft. If it's an EIS-level amendment, it would be a 45-day public comment period. If it's an EA-level amendment and a public comment period is offered, it would be 30 days. All right. Responsibilities. So we highlight these three terms in the proposed rule. First is BLM director and the responsibilities that go along with the director. Second is deciding official. This is a new term. So if essentially anywhere where the current regulations say state director, we'd replace this with a broader term, deciding official. And then the third is responsible official, a new term. So anywhere where the existing regulations say field manager, we'd replace this with this broader term, responsible official. The BLM director would be responsible for determining the deciding official and the planning area for RMPs. They would also determine the deciding official and the planning area for amendments that cross state boundaries. The deciding official would determine the planning area for all other types of amendments, so ones that don't cross state boundaries, and they provide supervisory review, including plan approval. In most situations, we expect that it would still be the state director who is the deciding official. The one situation where it may not be the state director is if we have a planning area boundary that crosses state boundaries, we might identify a single state director for that planning area rather than having two plans in each state. And then finally, the responsible official prepares the RMP. This might be a field manager. It might also be a district manager. In many situations, we're already doing this because our existing regulations provide flexibility in this area. For example, in Nevada, many of our RMPs are already at the district level, and the district manager is the responsible official. And then finally, my last procedural change slide is on the transition provisions. So we recognize that there are many plans out there that are in some stage of development right now, whether they're somewhere between the draft RMP or the proposed RMP, or they've already finished protest. We know that when the final rule comes out, there's still going to be some plans in those stages of development. So what we've written into here is that if the notice of intent was published before the final rule is issued, then the BLM would complete the RMP or amendment using either the existing regulations that were in place when the notice of intent was published or the revised regulations. This is essentially to make it so that, for example, if we have a plan that is past the proposed, they've gone through protest, the final rule comes out, they don't have to start over. They don't have to throw out 5, 6, 7 years of hard work from both our efforts, our offices, and also our public and our partners. They would finish it, and then they'd use the revised regulations the next time they initiate the planning cycle. Of course, any of our RMPs that are early on, we would encourage to use these concepts to the extent that they could, and the extent that it's practical. And actually, for some of these concepts, the ones that you can already do, we're already encouraging plans. For example, the Eastern Colorado RMP did an envisioning process and went through that process, I believe, about a little under a year ago. So we're already seeing some of these more general concepts get applied. So how to provide your public comments. There's 3 ways that you can submit comments, either by mail, personal or messenger delivery, or through the federal e-rulemaking portal. These are the only 3 ways that we can accept comments. If you send them in another way, unfortunately, we cannot accept them. This information is in the fact sheet that you picked up today, so you don't need to write it down. It's also available, it's in the rule itself. And just a quick tip, if you go to the e-rulemaking portal at regulations.gov, if you search by the Federal Register number that I've put here, this is also in your fact sheet, 2016-03232, that'll take you directly to the proposed rule, which is titled Resource Management Planning. There's also a link to the direct rule at the bottom of this slide. Otherwise, it can be a little tricky to find the rule itself on that website. And just a few recommendations for submitting comments. To the extent that it's possible, be specific in your comments. That will help us in trying to understand them. Reference the section number in the regulations if you can. So for example, if you have comments about plan components, reference proposed section 1610.1-2 where the plan components are discussed in the regulations. And then make sure to provide an explanation of why you're in favor or not in favor of a proposed change so that we understand what you mean by your comments. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. So I hope we have a few minutes for questions.
No, we're actually kind of running late.
We're running late, so maybe
Yeah.
1 or 2 clarifying questions.
Yeah, are there any questions just about the presentation? Because we're going to have discussion in the work groups on the topics. Okay. I forgot to mention, we need microphones because on live streaming they can't hear you.
Is
you
this
just
the
wanted
slide
the
you were talking
information?
about?
So, in the interest of moving us along, so I'm just going to describe the breakout groups, and for those of you, thank you, Shasta. Those of you on live streaming, we're going to shut it down and we'll beam it back up at 12:15, I believe it is. Yeah, so tune back in at 12:15, and for those on live streaming, if you have questions, you can feed them in to the team, and they will be handing us a handful of questions to ask at the end in the final plenary. And now for the roundup of how we're going to do the breakout groups. So we have 4 topics, and you may have wondered why your sign-in name card had a little red dot, had a colored dot on it, and that was to help us sort into the groups. So if you have a red dot, you're going to start at the back at the public involvement section. If you have a green dot, you're over here for the planning assessment and high-quality information. If you are a yellow dot, planning assessment over in that corner, and landscape analysis is at the end over there. So if you could, whatever color dot you are, go to whichever color that is to start. And then your facilitation teams are actually going to rotate. So you're able to cover all these topics, and you stay put and we move around so we can have a discussion. Also to let you know, Art in the back is graciously going to be a time manager for us, so we have a tight time frame to try and get this done, 1 hour max. He's going to give a 2-minute warning to the entire group so you know you're going to be about to be done that topic, and then he's going to call it, and the facilitation teams are going to need to cut off and rotate to the next session. And just to remind ourselves to abide by the ground rules, I encourage respectful discussion, listening to each other, and also being relatively brief so we have time for everybody to participate. Focus on clarifying questions that you have to understand what's the intent of the rule, and also a discussion amongst you as a group to explore ideas and suggestions and thoughts you have. I think that's it. So go find your colored dot and we'll get going.